Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Alina Polyakova. I'm the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. It's my pleasure to introduce the event today and to introduce Dr. Alan Riley, whose report we're launching today. The report titled Ukraine versus Russia and the Kleptocrats, which outlines the legal mechanisms for how Ukraine can pursue Russia and the kleptocrats who stole Ukraine's assets under the Yanukovych regime in legal and international courts. Just a few words about our work here at the Eurasia Center. And for those of you who are following the live cast on the internet, please use the handle at AC Eurasia or the hashtag AC Ukraine to join the conversation. So after the Maidan Revolution, Ukraine was left with almost nothing in its state coffers. It's estimated that over $40 billion was missing as Yanukovych and his regime left Ukraine absconded for Russia. As we know now, this left Ukraine in a very dire situation Ukraine has had to rely on loan guarantees from the international community and other Western economies. And all those assets have largely been left unrecovered in Ukraine. A lot of that has to do, as Dr. Allen will surely discuss, with the lack of legal resources to recover those assets and other, legal avenues for how those assets have remained hidden. And as we all are probably aware, from the recent leaks from the Panama Papers, this is not a non-common way in which kleptocrats and other government officials have used to hide their assets abroad in offshore accounts. So this is an important issue, and we're very honored to have Dr. Riley here with us today. Dr. Riley is actually a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council of the Global Energy Center. He was formerly professor of law and the director of the Master of Laws program at the City Law School in City University, Gray's Inn, London. Dr. Riley is a specialist in the fields of energy and antitrust law and has written extensively on European Union energy markets, liberalization, energy security, and energy geopolitics. And he's joining us here directly from England, and he's promised to not make too many Brexit jokes. So with that, Alan, I'll give you the floor.
Well, it's very nice to be here on a spring morning in Washington with actual sunshine. Something I have to say on the grey banks of the Thames, when we're all talking about whether or not we are European, is not really still with us. We still seem to be in winter. Perhaps spring is coming. But spring is an issue for Ukraine. A country which has received a number of blows of economic collapse, of its former government, troops shooting its own people on the streets of its capital city, and invasion, occupation and annexation by its neighbour. Now, amongst all these blows, there are two double blows it has received, if we sort of quantify these things in legal and damages terms. One is simply the breathtaking theft by the former regime of the state assets, state properties, the properties of third parties on a gargantuan scale over the 4 years that Yanukovych was president, leaving, as Alina said, the state treasury empty. In addition to those losses, you then have the losses from the invasion, occupation and annexation of parts of Ukraine. And those losses are not insignificant. The Donbass has been wrecked. Crimea has been looted. The hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have been internally displaced. Their businesses, their employment has been wrecked. Their lives have been wrecked. When you start thinking about the role of law in all of this, international law, domestic law, Ukrainian law, US law, the law of other OECD states, the initial reaction is to think of Jeremy Bentham in his views of natural law and international law, that this is all nonsense on stilts. These arguments and these issues are arguments and issues for great power politics, for leverage, for international politics. They are not for law. And I think the argument against this is, first of all, one of principle, that the Western states are states which are subject and believe in the rule of law, and that Ukraine wants to join that family of nations and put law at the centre of its bureaucratic, political and commercial civilization. There is also, I think now, an issue of practice as well, that in a much more globalised world, even undemocratic regimes, regimes which do not internally have any great regard for the rule of law, have to deal with legal structures internationally, and that provides us with a basis for leverage. And I'll develop that as I go. So let me first of all turn to one of the two issues that I'm going to deal with today. And the first is the Ukrainian theft issue, the theft of billions and billions of dollars by the previous government. Now, I would not, if you asked me, be able to give you any sort of total figure. Who knows? Mr. Yanukovych may have some idea, but I can't really give you a total figure for that. What we can say is that if we drill down into some of the types of fraud, where there is some evidence, some traceability, some paperwork, we can start at least getting some fix on the scales of the theft that has taken place. And in my paper, I look at two types of theft. One is in relation to VAT or sales tax fraud, and the second is in relation to public procurement fraud. And the great advantage of both of these is that there is, in order to perpetrate these frauds, you actually have to generate paperwork. And also, we have some sense. Public procurement is quite straightforward in the sense that we know the Ukrainian state in the Yanukovych area was spending roughly around $12 billion a year on public procurement. So that gives you a framework for working out some numbers to work out what exactly was going on and how big the fraud was. And also, there is quite a lot of evidence, particularly with the public procurement fraud, that this was not a super sophisticated operation. I think one of the kind of senses you get from a lot of the media commentary was all this was done by super clever Western lawyers helping the Yanukovych regime. A lot of this was done by a bunch of not very clever people from the Donbass who basically were playing games with the procurement regime. So they would either only ensure that the shortlist included their friends, and if anybody wasn't on the list, or was on the list, was not a friend, they will be persuaded off it, or they'd come up with some absurd technical disqualification to keep anybody who was qualified off the shortlist for the tender. So I think if we dig down into a lot of the procurement fraud, you're able to come up with both specific cases of fraud, evidence of that, and you're able to come up with some numbers. Now, there are a whole series of numbers. Different commentators do different figures, but I get figures as low as around 20%, as high as 50%. But let's just take a 20% figure. A 20% figure suggests around $2.5 billion a year. So we're already hitting $10 billion on procurement fraud as a first blush of this. It may be more. But you're getting a sense of where the numbers are potentially on procurement fraud during the Ukrainian, the last government. VAT fraud. The issues there are that the numbers are likely to be larger. One of the commentators suggests that the VAT fraud could have been about the size of, well, 1/4 of the Ukrainian state budget under the Yanukovych years, which is about $17 billion a year. that is about the same size as the initial IMF package. And the VAT fraud was actually, again, very simplistic. The essential thing with sales tax is that if you pass on the sales, the tax to somebody else, you have a potential recovery situation from the state. And so you have a right to VAT refunds. And the problem in Ukraine is that rather difficult to get your VAT refund, because you'd have to talk to people in the tax administration and they would expect a percentage. And there's actually a case in which the Securities and Exchange Commission was involved, where they estimated the VAT fraud in that particular case was around 18 to 20%. So around 18 to 20% of the legitimate refund had to go to tax officials. So you begin to get a sense, again, of the scale of what is going on, and the numbers can be crunched. So if you look at some of this, you get into a situation where you say a low ballpark figure for VAT and procurement fraud is, during the Yanukovych regime, is probably around 30 to 40 billion. And remember, I have not talked about any other form of fraud in the regime, playing with privatization, the proceeds, actual theft of corporate assets, simply coming in and corporate raiding against non-regime actors. I'm just talking about VAT and procurement fraud, where we've got some data, we've got some framework we can get around the numbers, and we can give some sense of what a credible low ballpark figure might look like. So that, I think, is where I start with this. The next question, of course, arises is, what can you do about it? And again, part of the lame approach to this is to say, well, all of these people who stole all this money are now largely in Russia, and are clearly beyond the jurisdiction of the Ukrainian government or any Western government. And most of their assets are in Russia, or they are they're in Mauritius or the Middle East. They may well be in the British Virgin Islands. They could be in the Caymans. We're getting into the Panama Papers discussion here to some degree. And one of my jokes about this is that one of the two things that Britain and America share are the glorious inheritance of the common law and our addiction to providing tax haven services to dodgy members of the global elite. And because the two largest tax haven facilities are the United Kingdom and the United States. The difference is, because the UK had the advantage of having had an empire, we have all these various offshore jurisdictions we can use to stick all this dodgy money in, whereas the United States has to simply hold it on land. So that there could be quite a lot of Yanukovych money potentially in American banks. And we haven't done anything about that. And this brings me to my point about recovery and how we can do it. One of the arguments about recovery is that at one side you could say, well, chasing around the world and trying to get this money out will take a long time and will be difficult. And I wouldn't entirely disagree with that. But if the numbers are as great as we think, then we should be able to get some scale of recovery within a relatively short space of time. But one option which I think is worth considering, and I raise in my paper, is the idea of a plea agreement. And this was used after the Rose Revolution in Georgia. And the essential approach, and again this is taken from the playbook of US federal prosecutors, is a sense of you create a credible threat, the prospect of prosecution, of credible prosecution, imprisonment, loss of livelihood, and potential loss of assets. And you make it clear to your target that the prosecution will not proceed if you surrender the ill-gotten gains. And the issue really in creating such a procedure is to create a credible threat. Now, in the case of the Georgians, the threat was sufficiently credible that very quickly about $1 billion was recovered for the Georgian state. So the question is could you do that in Ukraine? Now, the difficulty is that Ukraine, even compared to Rose Revolution Georgia in 2003-4, has a weak to non-existent credible legal order, in addition to which it doesn't have any familiarity with the common law concept of plea agreements. But that doesn't mean you can do it, because as I indicated earlier, because there is potentially US jurisdiction, some of the assets may well be here, and in any event, if they're not here, they may well have passed through US jurisdiction. There's also, similarly, it may well have passed through UK jurisdiction. And both Britain and America have concepts of plea agreements and being able to do deals. So the question is although we would need some Ukrainian cooperation, the actual plea agreement operation could essentially be an Anglo-American operation. And the issue therefore is creating a credible threat. And I will argue the credible threat is criminal prosecution against the looters under the Yanukovych regime, whether they're in Moscow or elsewhere, the issuance of red notices against them, and the creation of an asset recovery fund, and I'll discuss this later as to how to do that, so that there is sufficient cash to go on a major operation to recover the Yanukovych assets. And the fund is sufficiently large that we can go on with this for years and years. Because that gives then a sense of a credible threat. First of all, you can't move from Moscow because of the red notices and the prospect of prosecution. And plus, we're coming after your assets, and we're never going to give up. And then what you're able to say is that there is a deal to be done. Disgorge 80% of your assets. I'm just giving that as a sort of first blush figure we can talk about. Disgorge most of your assets, surrender them, and we will give you immunity from prosecution, remove the red notice, and you'll get EU visa rights, US visa rights, so you can move in and around the West. And you've got to think about this from the point of view of somebody who's in a nice suburb of Moscow at the moment and thinking about, the Russian economy is sinking, Vladimir's popularity is not what it was. How long will I be protected? How much can I rely on the Russians in truth? And is this a credible place for me to remain in the long run, when currently I have no more political power and no prospect of it? So in those circumstances, I think you are likely to get some people coming in, and I think it's worth a try. Now, there are two major objections to this. The first major objection is a moral one, is to say, these people are terrible, they looted the country, and there should be justice. And I can understand that. But we have to look also at the realities of the situation in terms of, do we want to recover most of the cash? And do we need the cash? And I would argue that we need the cash. And on the balance of justice and what the current value we can get for the Ukrainian state and people, this is an option that we should seriously consider. The second objection, which is, I think, a practical objection and a serious issue as to how we could actually go forward with this plan, is that it's the issue of actually success. If we recover assets on any scale, because of the continuing corruption of the current elite and people within the current government and the current state administration, what confidence does, say, the UK and the US have, and any Western states who seek to assist the Ukrainians, that the money just goes back into Ukraine and is recycled out into Swiss bank accounts once again? So we have an issue here of the credibility of the Ukrainian state. And one of my questions about my own proposal is the extent to which we can actually do this unless the Ukrainian state steps up to the plate and carries out substantial judicial and administrative reform in this area to give us credibility and confidence that we can take this forward. I think the other point about this is that although we could do a lot of this, the other question is also, which is linked into this, is we also would need, or even if you've got an Anglo-American operation driving this, you would need a substantial degree of cooperation with the Ukrainian administration, at least in terms of access to all the paperwork to run and develop these cases. So again, if you still have the same old practices going on in the same way, I doubt that that cooperation will be forthcoming. So I talked a lot about the Ukrainian side of the issue, the theft of state assets, and I should really now talk to Russia. And I have to say, I got a message this morning from one of my former Russian students who was reading my paper, and she said to me, I hope you're not expecting a Russian visa for the next 1,000 years, Alan, after that. So I may be the case. And I think the question of where we go from here and how you deal with Russia, again, you start with the same question. Surely this is nonsense on stilts. How can you sue Russia for the invasion and annexation of parts of Ukraine? Well, it's surely true that you've got takings of oil and gas in Crimea, the destruction of property, the damages of internally displaced people, the mass destruction of the infrastructure of the Donbass, the loss of human life. Suing Russia, surely, once again, Alan, you're talking legal nonsense on stilts. And, well, let me take you through why I don't think this is entirely nonsense on stilts. I think there's two parts. There's a technical legal argument about what is the best fora to bring cases in. But before I get that, I think where I would argue the Ukrainian government should really develop a major damages operation. And that is simply in terms of setting up a form of reparations office to gather all the information on the losses of people, businesses, local governments, and the central state in Ukraine. And then establish a credible international accounting board which would be able to verify those losses. Because if you simply do that, you put a number on what Russia owes Ukraine. And that number becomes important. Standards & Poor's and the other major ratings agencies may well take it into account as a liability of the Russian state. It could have effect on interest rates and Russian credit default swaps. You introduce it into the world as part of Russia's overall liabilities. Is it bigger than the current size of the Russian National Welfare Fund is an interesting question, for example. Probably yes. So you create a reality. It is a reality already, there are huge losses, but you put a number on it, you give it a structure and a framework, and you can, aside from any legal proceedings, you would be able to use this in any ultimate settlement negotiations on the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which will come at some point. So I think on those grounds alone, this is valuable. Now, I know there have been various discussions in Kiev about how to do this, and some nervous approaches to how to put all this together. But doing this in a credible, internationally verified way is the way I think we should initially approach the issue of losses in Ukraine as a process of recovery. Now, that's, I think, the practical thing we can do. The next question is in relation to what fora in which to sue. Now, there are a number of options here, but I think the one which makes the most sense, and is somewhat unfamiliar to American ears, is the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, of which Russia is a member. Russia and Ukraine are members. And the point about this is that all of the losses of occupation fall within various headings of the Convention provisions. So Article 2, right for life, Article 8, right to home, Article 1 of Protocol number 1, the right to property. So you can effectively take the losses and put them under the headings of the Convention provisions and the underpinning case law. The other point about it is that there is a great series of precedents in a number of cases between Cyprus and Turkey in relation to the invasion, occupation, and annexation of northern Cyprus. And there is an extensive case law over the last 3 decades in relation to that, which Ukraine can draw upon. And that there have been two cases which Ukraine has launched in relation to the invasion and occupation. But my argument is partly here is that it will be worthwhile thinking about bringing new cases and restructuring the old cases, and focusing each of the cases on different classes of people who've been affected. So, for example, the internally displaced people from the Donbass, you bring a case for them. You bring a case for the small business owners of Lugansk. You bring another case for the Crimean Tatars. You identify a case with a particular Ukrainian group who has suffered, and you get them off the ground. There are tactical arguments for this, because you don't want to do a mega case, and if there's some procedural failing, you lose the whole thing. But also, often, if you can get a case off the ground, you've got all the facts, the numbers, you can move with that more quickly than other cases. And you can get them going. And having more cases and giving them a colour and identity adds to the pressure on the Russian state. Now, of course, the nonsense and stilts arguments is to say, well, this is all very well. This is all fine and dandy, but suppose you can get a ruling from the European Court of Human Rights. What does it mean? And at one level, of course, yes, we can't simply send the bailiffs into the Kremlin and start seizing Russian state assets. And that's true, but it creates pressure. It creates pressure, and that pressure is worthwhile and valuable and adds to the sense that Russia has to account. There's also, since 2010, a new procedure under Article 46 of the Convention, which allows, if a state doesn't comply with a convention ruling, a court ruling, you can go back and the Committee of Ministers, by two-thirds majority, can send the case back to the Strasbourg court to provide a second ruling, say that they have not complied. And again, this is partly about Ukraine building support in the Council of Europe to say that these are credible losses of the Ukrainian people for blatant and substantial breaches of the convention for which Russia is responsible and has to pay. And that's building support. And part of it is to build pressure for settlement, and settlement to include the full losses that Ukraine has suffered to be repaid. And then the other part of this is to look at other measures which could be applied against Russia to obtain recovery and build political support for those. One of them I raise is perhaps a European model of the United Nations Compensation Commission, which provided for recovery of losses suffered by Kuwait after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1991. And under Security Council resolution, the Compensation Commission was allowed to take up to about a third of Iraqi oil and gas revenues and apply them to the losses to pay off the losses of Kuwait and actors in Kuwait who suffered. Now, we are a long way from that. We couldn't do it by Security Council resolution for obvious reasons. Perhaps we may be able to do it at a European level. But again, you could raise and develop that. And again, it's all building pressure. Then finally, what I would say is this. If we're looking at at where we go from here, I think one of the major issues is to look first is how you structure an asset recovery operation for the Yanukovych assets, or the assets still under the Yanukovych regime. This is not a small operation, and to be credible, you would need a substantial funding behind it. These days, you possibly can get commercial funding to back it. They take a percentage of the recovery. There are various funds which operate to do that. It's a very big operation. You probably need about $50 million a year to run a major global operation against this. Another option will be to link a recovery of Ukrainian assets to additional loans to Ukraine. So you can imagine a situation where we provide them with $20 billion. 500 million is allocated for recovery operations, and any assets which are recovered are set off against the loan to Ukraine. And that's a potential we could look at. In relation to ECHR, I think the argument here is that, as I say, the creation of an international accounting board and providing credible numbers creates immense pressure on the Russians and is worthwhile of itself. The ECHR cases I think when you actually analyse all the other options, this is the best option to go for in terms of providing a credible fora with a credible case law where we already have existing case law on the occupation invasion issues. So I think those are where I would start with all of this and try and build from there. But my real question on all of this is how far the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian state bureaucracy are actually willing to engage on these issues and proceed forward to recover for the losses that Ukraine and the Ukrainian people have actually suffered. And there, I think I'll stop. Thank you. Okay, please.
I'm a lawyer. I find it more convenient to stand behind a lectern when I address the court. My name is Walt Slocum. I am a director and secretary of the Atlantic Council. I want to welcome all of you here, and particularly Wendy Makins, who is one of the oldest friends of the council and an old friend of mine, and I'm very glad to see her here. We have a very well qualified panel to comment on the paper we've just heard. First of all, Ambassador Boyden Gray, who is a founding partner of Boyden Gray and Associates and a member of and a director of the Atlantic Council. He has had extensive experience in connection with the European Union, having served as special envoy for European affairs and as ambassador of the United States to the Union. He is also a lawyer, a partner at one time at the great firm of Wilmer Cutler, Pickering, Hale and Dorr. He was White House counsel during the George H.W. Bush administration and legal counsel to Vice President Bush. He's a graduate of Harvard University and a JD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I am proud to say was a colleague of mine when he was a law clerk for Chief Justice Warren. Ruth Wedgwood is that most unique of animals. She is a practical-minded international lawyer.
I'll take offense to that.
She is more specifically the Edward B. Burling Professor of International Law and Diplomacy at SAIS. And she was a member of the World Bank International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, the U.S. delegate to the Human Rights Committee, and a member of the U.S. delegation to OECD. She's taught at Yale Law School, the University of Paris, the Hague Academy for International Law, and the U.S. Naval War College. So the two of them are very well qualified to speak. They are not they may be qualified, they are not authorized to speak more than 5 minutes each, and then we will take comments from the group. Boyden?
Well, let me open by saying that I appreciate, Walter, the introduction. I was, as he says, special envoy to the European Union for Eurasian Energy Affairs, which was separate from my job as ambassador to the EU. And in that capacity, I have been both a predecessor and a successor, or successor and a predecessor of Richard Morningstar, who I think took over the job of special envoy. You may wonder what a special envoy is. Well, it's very special. When I was a special envoy, I think there was only one other in the entire system. And since Brussels is full of ambassadors, it gave me great prestige to be known as a special envoy. On my last night in Brussels, I was packing up to leave as ambassador, and I was invited to have dinner with the commanding general, a Brit, who was the commander of the European Defense Force, which puzzled me at the time since there wasn't really a European Defense Force. It was just NATO forces who would sometimes change their labels. But he commanded a house, a chef, a staff, and in order to get me to attend the dinner, he sent the list of the invitees, and I was listed as C. Boyden Gray, U.S. Special Convoy. So I think I qualify and know something about war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Yes. I have to say I am very skeptical that your rather well thought out and elaborate plan would actually work. But I'm not sure that's your main point in some ways. I think what I think is the value of what you've done is to illustrate how badly the Russians view the rule of law and how important it is for the West and for Europe to underscore their need to come a little bit closer to the values that we share across the Atlantic community. I remember once speaking at Jones Day shortly after Erwin Griswold retired from the Harvard Law School, where I actually did not go. Walter went there, I did not. But he nevertheless was very nice to me. And he had just come back from what was supposed to be a 6-month tour in Russia to teach the rule of law and the values of an independent judiciary. And he left and came back to Jones Day after only 6 weeks. And I said to him, how could you possibly renege on such a major commitment to Russia to teach them the rule of law? And he said it was hopeless. He said the Russians are hopeless. There's no way to teach them anything about the rule of law. I said, well, what did you tell them when you left? And he said, I told them, it's time you go back to the Magna Carta and start all over again. And so your report is valuable to remind us that they may not have to go back 1,000 years, but maybe Magna 1215 would be a good starting point. So I do think your report will serve that purpose, and that is worth doing even if the recovery doesn't amount to much, because I don't think you'll get much from it. But I think rhetorically it could be extremely important. My experience on the energy front, and Richard Morningstar knows this well, was to try to get the Europeans to understand that if they had done to Microsoft what they had done, and if they're going to do to Google what they would probably like to do to Google, they really ought to treat Gazprom the same way. And that would be a great lesson for the Russians, to have Gazprom treated the way they treat other alleged monopolists. The answer to that I would get back when I made the suggestion was, well, Gazprom is, they're based in Moscow. And I said, well, where do you think Microsoft is based? A lot further away than Moscow. And the same is true of Google. So if there's a lesson to be learned from this, the thing that I take away from this is that, and I had until this report came out, real sense of just how extensive the theft was, is this should shed a light on the way Russians behave, and they really ought to learn what we all have accepted in the West since the Roman Empire. So thank you for your elucidation and illustration of just how bad this performance was.
Thank you. Ruth?
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the paper. And my patronymic actually is a Russian name, but I don't use it because I think it means Jew from the dark part of the forest. Glushin. Well, a couple of thoughts. I mean, one is I do take the point of the value while the facts are fresh, because I used to be a trial lawyer, of summoning them, because you never know when you're going to run across a leprechaun or a hidden bank account in the Fonseca computer splash. So if you have, you don't, tarry not on the facts, because you can never really resurrect them. The witnesses disappear. You can't get affidavits. It's stale. It's old. So it does make a point to have a record. And there are, as you know, precedents, for example, in the claims commissions for a whole variety of cases. One, of course, was the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal. Not that we ever expected to get a great deal of money from it early on, but it presented a place where the Iranians and the U.S. could talk together in an offline way, and eventually some reparations were made for losses suffered. And there are lots of other similar kinds of attempts to levy an accounting of what losses may have been incurred. Russian causality, well, one can infer, but it's harder to prove, I suppose. The little green men have hung up their jackets, but still, there's enough corroboration of Mother Russia's involvement. I do think your timing is perfect coming to Washington, because this is the moment of black money and the need for some kind of global financial integrity but the Brits are also deeply complicit in this. I used to wonder why lawyers in London made so much more than lawyers even on Wall Street, and the answer is they're servicing all the accounts in the Channel Islands. It's not London. It's all the dumped money that keeps Sting and others in good stead. So there is a huge amount of black money out there that's invisible, not taxed, moved around without accountability. It's not just Panama, it's all over the world. And the Swiss were doing this for years, of course, Jewish money and other assets. So there is a world out there to be explored. It's very hard to get into it. Frankly, probably undercover operations and tape recordings and some daring do was the only way to really nail people in ways that would cause them to flip and cooperate and make available their testimony to prosecute other people. On Mother Russia, it's such a set of ironies. Again, if you look at Tsar Nicholas II, he was a great man, and Friedrich Martens was his legal advisor, and he was the guy who, in fact, crafted the 1899 Hague regulations in 1907, and therefore was, in fact, an extraordinary contributor to the amelioration of the harshness of war. So the modern law of war owes its shaping not just to Francis Lieber in the American Civil War, but to the Russians, to Friedrich Martens. So in fact, there is a liberal spirit in Russian law. If you actually wonder where the idea of laws of humanity comes from, that's from Friedrich Martens. So there's something to appeal to Russia that's pre-Soviet, which means something to them culturally, if you ever could begin to hope to have some evolution. But at the moment, I think we're largely outpaced by tradecraft. They're very good financial investigators in the Treasury Department. Some of these contingent-funded claims recovery law firms like to suppose that their investments are not for naught. But it's going to take a great deal of work to get up and inside the off-the-shelf black organizations that, in fact, manage this money. I do think that one could think of more creative uses of wiretaps, of interception of the clearing of currencies through New York. I mean, usually if you want to have a lawsuit or a criminal prosecution in the U.S., it's not very hard because everybody clears their dollars through the U.S. So you certainly would have venue here. But Ukraine at the moment is in chaos. Mother Russia has sane people. Sergei Lavrov, my old buddy from New York who used to be perm rep, knows what end is up, but he's also very, very close to Putin. And Putin likes being very rich, and anybody whose power is brittle is going to be looking toward his afterlife and therefore want to keep a great deal of money in hand. So how you actually revive a sense of liberal, a liberal account of the war and of the law in Russia itself is a generational project. But I do think, frankly, where I would spend my next year and a half is Fonseca, and decrypting those airtails and wiretaps and intercepted bank transfers. And I have somebody we should have lunch with together next week, named Scott Horton, who's trying to do just that, to really try to just map out some of the major venues, intermediaries. It probably isn't actually that many people. All you really need is a network of about 12, 24 people to have a very sophisticated black transfer system. But the other problem only is that, is that obviously, sentimentally, Ukraine matters, is something quite different to Russia than to us. That they do see Kievian Russia, Rus, ancient Rus, as being in the heart of Ukraine. And therefore they do, in a very gut-wrenching way, have the belief that they own it. And even though they starve the Ukrainians in the terrible famine under Stalin, they are not the least bit reluctant to still exercise a very heavy hand. You're waiting, I guess, clearly you're a man with patience and ingenuity. You have to wait for the unicorn to come, bearing a gift in its mouth or a little dead drop where somebody will share with you. But when I was a prosecutor, you really just, I always thought the thing to do was to talk to people endlessly, put together bits of data, show them you know more about them than they know. They're always surprised what you know. And they finally come to see you as a raconteur of their own family history and start telling you stories just for amusement. So, do you speak fluent Russian?
I have some, but not
okay. But I would have a whole bunch of old boys who speak Russian going out and chatting. So there's no easy answer other than to say that global financial transparency should be a very high American foreign policy objective, that we should be, in fact, using our own strength to put the kibosh on all of these offshore, whether the Caribbean or Channel Islands or Asian dead drops. And we're losing a huge amount of tax revenues, as is Europe, quite apart from issues of corruption.
Well, thank you both very much, Ambassador Gray and Professor Wedgwood, and not least for having good Stakhanovich, you over-fulfill your quota on not talking too long, leaving plenty of time for questions. Does somebody want to begin? Yes, sir, in the front row. If you could state your name and affiliation. And
Atlantic
perhaps
Council.
ask a question. This is not a reflection on you. Perhaps ask a question as well as making a brief statement if you want to make a statement.
3 points. You mentioned, Alan, that the problem is to get cooperation with the Ukrainian government. And I would argue towards you that it's really only one person that is essential, the Prosecutor General. And we have no reason that there will be to believe that there will be a Prosecutor General who will pursue anybody. Not one single person from the Yanukovych regime has been prosecuted, nor is that likely to happen. What can you do then? Second point, the big money that is immediate is the 3 cases between Gazprom and Naftagaz, which is about $60 billion together. I think that's where the West really need to help Ukraine. And then the third thing, many of East Donetsk people live in one specific place, Monaco, not in Moscow. Shouldn't something be done in this regard, simply give a visa ban? Thank you.
Right, thanks. I think there are a number of things which are worth pointing out here. I would say just generally that what I was trying to do was provide a kind of route map and of what is possible or what could be done if there was the willingness to do that. But obviously, as you were saying, there is real issues about the willingness to proceed. Now, I actually would divide the paper's divided into 2, looking at the Yanukovych issues, asset issues, and the occupation liability issues. I think, as a practical matter, the easier option, the thing which there could be political support to move on, is the moving down the road of creating a verifiable account of the losses that have been suffered during the invasion, occupation, and annexation. And I think that is something that you could do, and you could follow up by having strategic litigation at ECHR, all puts pressure on and it doesn't engage a lot of the other issues in Ukraine. So you see how that is. I think that if you ask me which of these is the most politically acceptable, given current Ukrainian realities, that may well be the case. And that then plays into the NAFTA gas issue, is because there is, we can have an argument about what constitutes set-off and so forth. But if you have a situation where we've got a bigger number than the 60 billion or so that the Russians claim, then we have got a significant bargaining chip in those negotiations. And I think that's something which may well be able to be played out. Whether you can actually do direct commercial set-off is another issue, but you do have a bargaining chip. So that's an issue with that. And the Monaco issue is true. I mean, one of the points about this is if you do launch all of these, if you do actually get some support to launch some asset recovery operation, and you do actually you create a plea agreement system, and you start looking for prosecutions of these people, it would make the Monaco residency of the ex-Donetsk regime people impossible. There'll be red notices. That alone would cause a huge degree of difficulty. So the point is that if you could get some degree of cooperation on that issue, you could be quite effective. But probably for the moment, I would think it's the occupation liabilities which probably got the greatest potential for some practical Ukrainian support.
Yes, in the back by the window.
Yes, hello, Mitchell Pullman. I'm a freelance writer and consultant. I wanted to go back to your point about if you could put a dollar figure on Ukrainian losses, which, if I'm not mistaken, I believe you were referring to losses through corruption to Russia, and it would affect Russia's Standard & Poor's rating. It seems I've heard that Russia's latest plans for keeping its economy afloat include floating bonds. So I was wondering if you could just kind of connect the two and expand on that, if you would.
Okay, I think essentially we're talking about two different types of losses. One is the losses from the theft by the former regime. And as I say, it is hugely opaque and very difficult to say. But as I say, if drilling down into the VAT and public procurement regime, I think you come to a fairly conservative estimate is around $30 billion. And that's just for those two types of fraud. Now, there are questions about how we recover that, and I can put that on the table. But what you're talking about, I think, is essentially the liabilities that flow from the invasion, occupation, and annexation of Ukraine. Well, no, but if you're talking about the Russian bonds, the link between the Russian bonds and doing anything to challenge any Russian financial instrument, the basis for it would have to be the invasion, occupation, liability losses, not the Ukrainian theft assets. Because the Russians may have had some level of hand in the Ukrainian thefts, but essentially the thefts were carried out, directed and organized by Yanukovych and the other officers of his regime and his Donetsk clan. They were not, directly organized by the Russians. So I'm already, it's bad enough that I'm trying to fix the Russians with tens of billions of dollars of liability losses from the occupation, damages for the occupation. I don't think being fair to the Russians, they're not directly responsible for the Ukrainian theft issues, and that is separate. So I think it's where you would be looking at is the liabilities for Russia, which flow from the occupation. And I think what the point about it is once you've got a credible accounting of the losses, and once you have got some litigation underway in say the ECHR as the fora you would use, you are beginning to be able to raise the issue of how far can you raise challenges to all sorts of financial instruments arbitration proceedings? How far can you go down the route of actual setting off any Russian claims against the liabilities that Russia has to Ukraine? Now, there are a whole series of technical issues here. You have one of the issues is simply identity of actors. Is the Russian Federation, qua the Russian Federation, who undertook the occupation of Ukraine and caused the losses, exactly the same as the entity who has claims against Ukraine? So you get into lots of issues like that. But the point about it is you can move down that route and start raising these issues in a whole series of different fora. And even raising this issue is putting enormous pressure on. It creates a lot of difficulty. You gain leverage. So I think there is an argument for doing this, which it does give you. It effectively weaponizes your losses and allows you to deploy them to your advantage.
Right. I should mention, if I may, Mr. Chair, just that there are precedents for, again, just in a kind of hygienic, preparatory way, having these rosters. Yeah. So in the Ethiopia-Eritrean War, there was a very careful accounting done of the mutual losses suffered by each side, looking toward possible compensation set off, but just one doesn't have to have the mechanism and the remedy to make it sensible to do real-time accounting of profits and losses. And so too, whether I agree with it or not, the Israeli wall, the Secretary General, 38th floor in the UN decided to have an accounting of the wall and what harm it was thought to have done to the Palestinian people. So there's timely things to be done, which have both public policy purposes as well as the possibility of reparations. But I do think the real lever one has is to begin to annoy, in a proper name way, the folks who run around the world doing arbitrage with these regimes and naming names. And even though Mother Russia, again, typically takes reservations to all the treaties that you think they should really be held accountable under, like airplane hijacking, aircraft bombing. They've quietly taken reservations to any judicial enforcement. But nonetheless, to, as you, I think, properly put it, to make the factual record while it's fresh. Take depositions, get affidavits. In civil litigation, you don't have to have a live witness. So that if you gather facts now, one could do something later. It would be extremely costly, so you'd have to find a sugar daddy. But
Ambassador Morningstar.
oh dear.
That was dramatic.
Why don't you sit, sir?
My
suggestion.
shoe went over.
I understand.
Goodness.
Anyway, that's a first for me. Anyway.
Do we need to test you for polonium?
Well, after some of the things that I've been saying recently, that may be the case. Anyway, other than paralleling Boyden's career, I am here at the Atlantic Council, but I do agree with what Boyden said, and I think the report is very valuable from the standpoint of exposing what Russia and what Ukrainians have done. The one thing that I don't have much hope for through experience is the European Court for Human Rights. My experience has been in Baku, and there have been any number of judgments from the European Court of Human Rights that just get ignored. You know, they order the release of prisoners. They come up with pitiful small judgments, and the government of Azerbaijan just ignores it, and nothing happens. You would wonder why, at some point, the Council of Europe wouldn't expel countries that don't comply with their judgments. So I don't see that as much hope, and in some ways almost counterproductive, because they do things and then nothing happens at all. I guess the point that I would make is, and it's, I think, maybe similar to what Ruth was saying, and the question, can we come up with a good target list of individuals, not just Yanukovych, but a bunch of different people, who, if they ever show their face outside of Russia or Ukraine, that jurisdiction could basically take jurisdiction either for criminal or civil proceedings, seize assets if they can be found in various places, and use that as a lever. And now I'll try to sit down and not twist my ankle when I sit down.
If I could ask a question that's a supplement of that. Given the importance of the project and the difficulties of the two routes that you've explored, is there a possibility of a third front? You made the point that the proceeds of the theft of assets, of the Ukrainian corruption, have presumably not been kept in Ukraine or probably not entirely in Russia. So they do exist somewhere outside. And based on experience, you would guess a fair amount of it is real estate. Is there a possibility of going after real assets, in principle financial assets, that are held outside, and conceivably either going after them directly, as was done after the fall of Marcos in the Philippines, or going after them on the grounds that you have a judgment from somewhere that would entitle you to recover the property of the judgment debtor? So to speak then, is there a third front of going after the physical assets that have been used, that are the proceeds of the illegal activity?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me just take it on the ECHR thing. I understand where Dick is coming from, the ECHR, but it's worth pointing out that up until the recent Russian radicalization, surprisingly, if you managed to get if you were Russian and you've got to manage to get a case before the ECHR, the presidential administration had a kind of ECHR unit and would do a deal, and you would actually have settlements which would deal with the issue. Some cash would be paid out. Now that ended with the increasing radicalization of the Russian state. So that's true. So probably now Russia is in much more of a, if you like, Azeri situation with its approach to this. But the point about it is that you're getting yourself into a fora. Ukraine is building support, and you have a basis of legal precedent which you can use. And I think it is all. I mean, I agree. They're not going to move if they get a whole series of rulings against them. But nevertheless, you're building pressure, you're building support, and I think that is where I think the ECHR issue comes in. On the real estate issue, I think this takes us back again into the kind of Panama issue, and there are lots of questions here. I mean, the UK government is supposed to be setting up a central register. I mean, we have a situation in the UK is that ordinary British citizens who buy a house have their name on the land register. We have a central, in England and Wales, we have a central land register with your name on the register for the property that you own. And but however, because if you hold it offshore, you can hold it behind via a nominee, an offshore company with nominee directors, and you have no idea who owns that asset. And I think there was a piece in the FT the other day which gave you lists of all the central London districts in Mayfair and St John's Wood, which I think is 25%, and some of these districts are owned through these sort of companies. And I suspect that if you have a look on in some US states where the rules are more opaque than others, you may well find a similar issue. So I think there is a real an issue here, and I suspect you'll find it if you dig in a number of other European states. Spain is one country in which you see this, France another. So I think you dig, you could find quite a lot of this. And of course, you say they're physical assets. They can't run away in the same way. And any transaction is much more easily noticed. So I think there is that. But I think one of the real issues with all of this is, and it is an Anglo-American issue, because it's the Brits with the city and the offshore dependencies, and it's the US, which is extremely vigorous internationally, but extremely soft domestically. So lots of things are held here and are hanging around, and nobody's saying anything or doing anything. And there is and there is an issue for both countries to actually get their act together and to do this. And I want to make another point. The more I've got into this and looked at this, I think there is a fundamental problem here for not just the UK and the US, but for all the Western democracies. And I think the fundamental problem is this, that would Britain and America have become functioning liberal democracies if in the 17th and 18th centuries there had been the equivalent of offshore jurisdictions where the elites could steal their money? The reason why democracy was forged in Britain and America and it worked is at the end of the day, the elites had to do a deal in order to maintain control of their assets. And to a large degree, what we are doing by running these offshore asset operations is we are making it extremely difficult for liberal values to triumph. We're actually undermining the growth of democracy worldwide. And I would argue that it becomes both a value issue for the West and even a national security issue for the West. That we are undermining our own security and we're undermining the capacity for the expansion of democratic values by allowing these offshore systems to exist.
If I could,
Go ahead.
I think that's a very good point, and this is what your paper does is to point to this whole set of issues. But I want to go back to Andrew's first question. You know, who starts the process? And I gather you think there has to be a Ukrainian special prosecutor, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, because I think without some central point to start this, whether it's the UN or Ukraine, that there won't be the spark that pulls people together, that embarrasses, say, the United States and Great Britain into a little more active supervision, etc. So how does it get started? Who initiates it? How does it get prosecuted, if you will? Ruth?
Just a couple of quick points. One is just I should mention, because he's a friend, and I'm not sure quite where I am on his issue, but there's a gentleperson named Mark Wolf, who's a judge in Boston, and he has been touting and championing the idea of having an international corruption court for so-called grand corruption, a really large 6, 9, 12-figure corruption. I'm afraid that might include more people than he even expects. Certainly the entire city of Chicago, a lot of New York, and don't know about Washington. But his thought is that we've become much more creative on looking at war crimes and crimes against humanity, and we've internationalized human rights issues in their adjudication. So why not corruption? Because that's what eats at the base of the ability of people to sustain their own societies. So it's worth thinking about that. On the great problem of opacity, of black bank accounts, of not being able to see through things, frankly, I've never quite understood the celebration of placeholders. And when I did landlord arson cases in New York City, trying to identify who my Hungarian gang was burning down, you couldn't tell, because all you had to do in New York City was give the name of the lawyer who would accept service of process for your corporation. So there's no roster anywhere of the real holders in interest. And that, I think, frankly, is something that governments could ask of their citizenry, not to have this be a charade of made-up names of the XYZ 1495 Popham Avenue corporations. That the governments, though the one wants to preserve privacy, if it's a government, you have a right to know who the real holders in interest are. And that is something I think we could insist upon. So, but this is really a signal moment, again, with the Fonseca dump. And I do think that with this, the instability of computer systems and the seeming inability of computer security managers to actually keep anything private permanently, there may be a new kind of anxiety among people who have parked their wealth offshore.
Yeah, I would have thought that ultimately the people who actually own the assets are known to somebody, because otherwise they don't really own the asset.
They're known only to the banker, perhaps.
Well, but they're known to the bank.
Yes.
I mean, my impression is that if you incorporate in Delaware, you don't need to reveal anything except the XYZ Corporation and the name of the lawyer who filed the request. Yes, sir, in the jacket.
Thank you. My name is David Nikradze. I represent Georgian television station Rustavito in Washington, D.C. I was wondering if you could give us your opinion on Dutch referendum where the majority of voters said no to association agreement between Kiev and Brussels. Can it become an obstacle for Ukraine's future development? Thank you.
Okay. Well, it's very interesting about the Dutch referendum. I think the point about it is it barely got over a 30% turnout. And so there are a whole series of questions about how far, how and in what way the Dutch government will treat the result of the referendum. It is in no sense binding on on the Dutch government. They merely have to take it into account. So I think that's the first thing to say about the referendum. Technically, a Dutch veto cannot block the coming into force and operation and continuing operation of the association agreement. I think that's one level. That is where we are with it. I think at another level, it shows again a broader issue that it was actually the whole thing and the people who were supporting it, supporting the referendum. All of their approach was this is not about Ukraine, this is about the fact we don't like the EU and we're dissatisfied with our government and with our elites. And that is what was going on. And most of the people who voted in favour of blocking the association agreement, that's what they were interested in. So there is and I think the underlying issue, particularly for Europe, but also for the US with the whole Trump business, is the dissatisfaction of populations throughout democracies, and then using any issue as a lightning rod, which from my perspective, of course, and I was not going to mention Brexit, as you raise a referendum, what do I do but raise Brexit, is that the potential for the Brits using the referendum as a lightning rod for domestic dissatisfactions. I said the difference is it's quite easy to vote against a trade agreement with Ukraine where the vote is only consultative and it doesn't matter, whereas the British referendum, it does matter. So I still think on the day that will go in the direction of Britain remaining in the European Union. But I think there are a whole series of questions around that. But it's a practical matter. It won't affect the association agreement with Ukraine.
Yes, sir, on the aisle here with the red tie.
Hi, my name is Farrell Charles. I'm with the Eurasia program at Open Society Foundations. And I just want to get your thoughts on what the role of NGOs and nonprofits should be in advocacy and support for organizations that would like to advocate the importance of abiding by the rule of law.
Bruce, you may be the best to address that. The question being the role of NGOs in promoting the rule of law internationally.
Well, if in the context of the present moment, so.
I think they're on automatically, okay. Which means we mustn't whisper to each other.
If you're thinking about, again, NGOs working to promote financial transparency, I would, again, be all in favor of that. Not that everybody should know your business or your corporation's business, or you might lose your competitive advantage, but that as corporations now presently have to do in every democracy, they pay income tax or corporate tax, to be willing to open one's books to regulatory authorities and not to have black books and black record keeping. I mean, it's really a limited number of countries that have made their main métier in having beautiful beaches where it's fun to get a tan and doing banking. It's become sort of a sultry little spécialité de maison for island states that have nothing else going for them. And since those people also want to go to college in the US and in Britain, I could see putting a lot of pressure on these special act banking black holes by limiting the convenience of their citizenry. There's no reason they have to make a living on banking.
I would add the United States should set a much better example in this respect than we do. Boyd?
there is always the prospect, which I've felt slightly, of retaliation by certain Russian authorities if you get too close to them. They had me tailed, which was quite flattering, actually. The KGB was following me around, and I once came back to do something with the State Department that they'd asked me to do on an economic conference with the Russians, and so I came back. I had time to resurrect a bridge game, which I normally played when I was in private life, and then the Undersecretary of State put together on a Sunday night before the conference started a cocktail party, and I said, "Oh my God, I'm going to lose my bridge game." But it was at 6 o'clock. My guests weren't coming till 7, so I went at 6, spent a little time, ran into, at the bar, a very, very attractive Russian gentleman who proceeded to chat me up, as it were, and I felt so happy with the way, I mean, he knew so much about me. It was just quite flattering. And then it dawned on me after about 15 or 20 minutes that he knew too much about me. And I said at about 7:45, "I've got to go. Thank you very much. I hope we'll have a good conference, but I have people coming for dinner." And he said, "Yes, you have your Sunday night bridge game." And I said, "Yes, I do. It's very nice." But it reminds me of Ambassador Bowen's great story about the Russians, the parable, you know the parable, about the bird on the road to Moscow. Very cold and windy Moscow morning, and this bird is in the road, and he's freezing to death, obviously. And a peasant comes along and sees him and takes the bird and spots a freshly laid, as we say, growing up in the South, a cow patty, and puts the bird in the cow patty. The bird warms up and starts chirping happily. And along comes another peasant, takes the bird out, seeing the bird in this horrible mess. He takes the bird out and puts it back in the road, and then comes a very fancy aristocratic carriage, oblivious to what's going on, runs over the bird and kills it. And the moral of the story is, he who puts you in it is not necessarily bad, and he who takes you out of it is not necessarily good. But in any event, when you're up to your neck in it, don't sing about it.
We have time for maybe one more if there. Yes, sir, in the blue shirt.
Hi, I'm Vitaly Shpak with the National Endowment for Democracy. Could you comment a little bit more on how likely you think that the West will seriously commit to the recovery of Yanukovych assets? And I'm specifically referring to the Pavlo Lazarenko case that you briefly mentioned in your report, the former prime minister of Ukraine who stole about $200 million. So I think that this case is significantly easier from the legal standpoint, but nevertheless, it's not moving anywhere. So it's been prosecuted. The guy was sentenced and spent many years in jail, but nevertheless, money is still not being returned to Ukraine. Thank you.
Yeah, I think as Anders was saying earlier, I mean, the difficulty with the recovery issue is the credibility of the current Ukrainian state. How far you can get any cooperation. I mean, the difficulty is, to start with, you need the papers. And that means you have to get them from the Ukrainian state administration. So you need cooperation at that level to start with. Even if it's going to be run as an Anglo-American operation, it's still we need the papers, and that's a kind of fundamental problem. And the other end of the problem is that even if we're terribly successful, we get all this money and so on, and we recover all this money. We do plea agreements, we can do some asset recovery, we have lots of law firms running around doing great things. The problem is we get the cash, and then what happens? If we do send it back to Ukraine, is the system still the same? The cash goes back in and disappears again. So I think one of the difficulties with all of this is that the willingness to spend limited both in terms of financial resources and limited in terms of human resources, we could be doing other more valuable and useful things, when the end result will be just another bunch of people will be taking the assets we've recovered and stealing them again. So I think that is, to my mind, the great difficulty with this. And I say, well, the part of it is to the reformist elements in the government and civil society in Ukraine is part of what my paper is saying is these are some of the things we could do if the government was changed significantly enough that we had trust and there was credibility. And trust and, unfortunately, credibility currently do not exist.
Ruth?
Just one last thought, and this is probably for an improved world, but I have been a critic of the International Criminal Court in various ways because of its inefficiency and its inability to choose appropriate targets. But it is the case that you could make certain kinds of corruption with international tethers and international crime, and have it be tried by an efficient, thank you, ma'am, court that doesn't take 12 years to go through a case, and then put some fear of God into folks. And indeed, there are countries themselves that exercise universal jurisdiction. Belgium, for example, has from time to time asserted universal jurisdiction over war crimes. And there's no obvious reason to me why, if you had a developing body of jurisprudence that said that certain kinds of corruption are international offenses against sovereignty, if you will, that you couldn't try them in international settings, even by having countries sign up, because people, when they are put to the task of not signing up, worry that it will give them away if they don't sign. So oftentimes countries and leaders sign juridical commitments against their better self-interest, but with consequences for their later chastisement.
I think we've come to the appointed hour. As the psychiatrist said, we have to stop. So if you can join me in thanking Dr. Riley and our panel, and then thank you all for coming.